What would you do if your husband stood up at your 30th wedding anniversary party and announced to everyone that you were a burden he needed to get rid of? I'm Diane Miller, 58 years old, and I spent an entire month planning what I thought would be the perfect celebration of 3 decades of marriage. I hired caterers, sent out elegant invitations, and even bought a new dress. A beautiful navy blue number that made me feel confident for the first time in years. The venue was our backyard, transformed with string lights and white roses, exactly like our original wedding. I thought this would be our moment of reconciliation, a chance to heal the cracks that had been growing wider between Richard and me. But instead of the romantic toast I had dreamed of, my husband Richard grabbed the microphone and declared, 30 years is more than enough. I need a younger woman, and she needs to move out of this house tomorrow. The entire room fell silent. Next to him stood Carla, my mother in law, wearing a satisfied smile as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. She actually started a slow clap, like this was some kind of performance she had been anticipating. I stood there in my carefully chosen dress, holding a champagne glass that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The faces of our friends, neighbors, and family members blurred together in a sea of shock and pity. Some looked away in embarrassment, others whispered among themselves. My own daughter Rachel stood frozen by the dessert table, her mouth hanging open. The humiliation was so complete, so public, that I felt like I might disappear into the ground. But in that moment of absolute devastation, something steel hard formed in my chest. I looked at Richard, this man I had loved, supported, and sacrificed for. And then at Carla with her triumphant smirk. If they thought I would slink away quietly like a wounded animal, they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. I would turn this humiliation into a comeback they would never forget. Let me take you back to how it all began. Because betrayal like this doesn't happen overnight. It's built brick by brick, lie by lie, until you're standing in the ruins of everything you thought was real. My name is Diane Miller, and until 6 months ago, I believed I was living a decent life. I'm 58, a retired elementary school teacher who spent 33 years molding young minds and coming home to make dinner for a family I thought appreciated me. Richard, my husband of 30 years, runs a successful accounting firm here in Chicago. To the outside world, we were the perfect middle class American dream. The stable couple with a beautiful daughter, a nice house in Lincoln Park, and enough money to take yearly vacations to Door County. But perfection is often just a performance, and I had been performing for a very long time. The cracks started showing when Carla, Richard's mother, moved in with us after her husband died 2 years ago. She was 76, sharp as a tack, and had very clear opinions about how our household should be run. At first, I welcomed her. She had just lost her life partner of 50 years, and I thought having family around would help her heal. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly she would take over. Diane, dear, she would say in that saccharine tone that made my skin crawl. A retired teacher wouldn't understand the complexities of financial planning. Perhaps it's better if Richard and I handle the important decisions. She said this while standing in my kitchen, reorganizing my spice cabinet because my system was inefficient. Richard, who had always been somewhat passive, began deferring to his mother on everything. When I suggested we finally take that European trip we'd been planning for years, Carla chimed in. At your age, Wouldn't a nice staycation be more appropriate? Richard nodded along like a bobblehead doll. The criticisms came in waves after that. My cooking was too heavy. My gardening was messy and unorganized. My choice of television shows was lowbrow. Even my book club friends were deemed gossips who waste time. Slowly but surely, I was being erased from my own life. You know what your problem is, Diane, Carla said one morning over coffee, speaking as if she were delivering profound wisdom. You never learned to manage money properly. A good wife should understand her place in the family hierarchy. Richard sat there reading his newspaper, saying nothing, which had become his favorite hobby. The financial manipulation started subtly. Richard began handling all our accounts without consulting me. When I asked about our savings, he would wave me off with, "Don't worry about it, honey. I've got it all under control." But I noticed things: the credit card statements that disappeared before I could see them, the hushed phone conversations about moving assets, the way Carla's eyes lit up whenever money was discussed. One evening, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Carla was on the phone in the living room speaking in a low voice she thought I couldn't hear from the kitchen. "Yes, the house is the main asset," she was saying. "Once we handle the Diane situation, everything will be much simpler to manage." The Diane situation. That's what I had become in my own home. A situation to be handled. I started paying closer attention after that, keeping mental notes of every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I was treated like hired help rather than the woman who had built this life alongside my husband. When Rachel came for Sunday dinner, she would hug her father warmly, but give me the kind of polite, distant embrace you'd give an acquaintance. Carla had been working on her too, dropping comments about how I was struggling with the transition to retirement and needed gentle handling. The breaking point came when I discovered that Richard had been secretly moving money from our joint accounts into ones that only he could access. Thousands of dollars, money I had earned, money we had saved together, simply vanished into accounts with his name only. When I confronted him, he looked genuinely surprised that I had noticed. "It's just better financial management," he said, not even looking up from his computer. "Mother suggested we consolidate things for tax purposes." "Without discussing it with me? With my money?" "Our money," he corrected, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe that anymore. That night, I lay in bed next to this stranger who wore my husband's face and made a decision. If they wanted to play games with me, I would learn the rules. I would start keeping my own secrets, making my own plans. Because something told me this was only the beginning, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The anniversary party had been my idea, a last-ditch effort to salvage what was left of our marriage, to remind Richard of the love we had once shared. I threw myself into planning it with the desperate energy of someone trying to resurrect the dead. I chose our favorite songs from 1994, our wedding year. I recreated the menu from our wedding reception. I even wore blue, the color Richard had always said brought out my eyes. But as I sent out invitations and arranged flowers, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was planning my own funeral instead of a celebration. The way Carla smiled when I told her about the party, the way Richard seemed distracted whenever I mentioned it, the way Rachel asked if she really needed to come. All of it should have been warning signs. Instead, I poured my heart into making it perfect, believing that somehow, if I just tried hard enough, I could love us back to who we used to be. I had no idea that they had been planning something entirely different. The month leading up to our anniversary party was like watching a masterclass in manipulation unfold in real time. If I had known then what I know now, I would have seen the signs everywhere. In every loaded comment, every meaningful glance between Richard and Carla, every phone call that ended abruptly when I entered the room. But I was still operating under the delusion that I was planning a celebration instead of walking into an ambush. The first red flag should have been Carla's sudden enthusiasm for helping with party preparations. This was the woman who had spent 2 years telling me I couldn't organize a grocery list properly. But suddenly, she was offering to coordinate with the caterers and assist with the guest list. "Oh, Diane," she said, flipping through my carefully written invitations. "You've invited the Hendersons?" I thought they moved to Florida. Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were calculating. "They moved back last year," I replied, not understanding why this mattered. "Hmm," she made a note in the margin. "And the Kowalskis? Are they still having those marital problems?" I should have asked why she cared. I should have wondered why she was suddenly so interested in the guest list. Instead, I was just grateful that she seemed to be taking an interest in something that mattered to me. The second red flag was Richard's behavior during party planning. My husband, who could remember the birthday of every client and the anniversary of every business deal, suddenly couldn't remember basic details about our own celebration. "What time is it starting again?" he asked for the fourth time in a week. "6 o'clock, Richard, same as every time you've asked. And remind me who's catering." "Antonelli's, the same Italian place where we had our first date anniversary dinner." He nodded absently, but I caught him making notes in his phone immediately afterward. When I asked what he was writing, he said, "Just work stuff. You know how it is." But I was beginning to suspect I didn't know how it was at all. The third red flag was Rachel's sudden distance from the party planning. My daughter, who usually loved family gatherings and had helped plan every birthday and holiday for years, seemed reluctant to engage with any of the anniversary details. "Mom, do you really think this is a good idea?" she asked during one of our phone calls. "What do you mean?" "It's our 30th anniversary. Of course it's a good idea. It's just things have been tense between you and Dad lately. Maybe a big party isn't the best timing." "That's exactly why we need this party," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice, "to remind ourselves of what we're fighting for." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. What if, what if you're fighting for something that's already gone? I should have listened to her. I should have heard the warning in her voice, the sadness that suggested she knew something I didn't. Instead, I brushed off her concerns and threw myself even deeper into party planning, as if the perfect centerpiece could somehow fix a broken marriage. The fourth red flag was the mysterious phone calls. Richard had always conducted business from home, so I was used to hearing him on the phone with clients and colleagues. But these calls were different. Whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room. Calls that happened late at night when he thought I was asleep. One night, I heard him in his office speaking in that careful, measured tone he used when he was trying to manage a difficult situation. "Yes, I understand the timeline," he was saying. "The party is Saturday. Everything will be handled by Monday, as we discussed." I pressed my ear closer to the door. "She won't be a problem. Mother has it all worked out. The documentation is ready. and she'll have no choice but to accept the new arrangement. My blood turned to ice water. They were talking about me. I was the she who wouldn't be a problem, the one who would have to accept some kind of new arrangement. But what arrangement? What documentation? I crept back to bed and lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had heard. What could they possibly be planning that required documentation and timelines? What kind of new arrangement was I going to be forced to accept? Sleep didn't come that night or many nights after. The fifth red flag was the way Carla started treating me in the weeks before the party. Not with her usual passive aggressive disdain, but with something that looked almost like pity. She would smile at me with the kind of sad, knowing expression people wear at funerals. "Oh, Diane," she said one morning, watching me arrange flowers for the centerpieces. "You're putting so much work into this. I hope you're prepared for whatever happens." "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" "Nothing, dear. I just mean that sometimes things don't go exactly as we plan them." But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes said she knew exactly how things were going to go, and she was already savoring the outcome. The final red flag came just 3 days before the party, when I accidentally discovered documents in Richard's briefcase that he had left open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I was simply moving the briefcase to wipe down the counter when papers scattered across the floor. As I gathered them up, certain words jumped out at me: dissolution of marriage, asset protection, primary residence ownership transfer, spousal support termination, divorce papers. Fully prepared divorce papers with my name on them, dated the Monday after our anniversary party. My hands shook as I read through the documents. According to these papers, I would be entitled to almost nothing. The house, our house, which I had assumed was jointly owned, was apparently solely in Richard's name. Our savings accounts, which I had believed were shared, were listed as his separate property. Even my teacher's pension was somehow entangled in language I didn't understand. But that clearly wasn't in my favor. At the bottom of the stack was a document that made my blood boil. A letter from Carla to Richard's attorney, outlining my unstable mental state and inability to manage financial affairs, recommending that I be deemed incompetent to handle any assets in a divorce settlement. They hadn't just been planning to leave me, they had been planning to destroy me. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands still trembling with rage and fear. Then I carefully placed everything back exactly as I had found it. If they wanted to play games with me, I needed to understand the rules they were playing by. That night, I called my old friend Margaret, who had gone through a brutal divorce 5 years earlier. "Maggie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need the name of a good attorney. A really good one." "Honey, what's wrong? You sound terrible. I think Richard is planning to divorce me, and I think he's been hiding assets. I need someone who can fight dirty." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know exactly who you need to call. Her name is Susan Chen, and she's a shark. But Diane, if you're going to do this, you need to be prepared for war." "I think the war has already started," I replied. "I'm just finally learning that I'm supposed to be fighting." The next morning, I made an appointment with Susan Chen for the Friday before the party. I spent that entire day laying out everything I had discovered: the secret phone calls, the financial manipulation, the documents. the way Carla had been systematically undermining me for 2 years. Susan listened to everything with the focused attention of a predator sizing up prey. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. Not a pleasant smile, but the kind of smile that said she was about to enjoy what came next. "Diane," she said, "I have some very good news for you. Your husband has made some serious miscalculations, and I'm going to help you make him pay for every single one of them." As I walked out of her office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope I had been living on, but real, solid hope backed by knowledge and strategy. The anniversary party was still happening. I was still going to smile and play the gracious hostess. But now I knew what was coming, and more importantly, I was ready for it. If Richard and Carla wanted to humiliate me in front of our friends and family, they were welcome to try. But they had no idea what they had awakened in their quiet, submissive little victim. They were about to find out that I was nobody's victim at all. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that makes Chicago beautiful. Clear skies, brilliant autumn colors, and a gentle breeze that made our backyard look like something from a magazine. I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to look perfect for what was coming. I put on the navy blue dress I had chosen months ago, the one that Richard used to say brought out my eyes. I did my hair in the elegant updo I had practiced 3 times during the week. I even wore the pearl necklace his mother had given me for my 50th birthday. The one she had pointedly mentioned was a family heirloom that should stay in the family. In the mirror, I looked like the picture of a devoted wife celebrating 3 decades of marriage. What the mirror couldn't show was the steel spine I had developed over the past week, or the documents I had carefully hidden in my purse, or the conversation I had had with Susan Chen that morning. "Are you ready for this?" Susan had asked. "I've been ready my whole life," I had replied. "I just didn't know it until now." The guests began arriving at 6, just as planned. Friends from the neighborhood, colleagues from Richard's office, people from my old school, family members from both sides. Everyone was dressed in their finest, carrying gifts and wearing the kind of warm smiles people save for milestone celebrations. They had no idea they were walking into a battlefield. I played my role perfectly. I greeted everyone with hugs and genuine warmth, accepted their congratulations gracefully, and made sure their drinks were always full. I was the picture of the gracious hostess, the devoted wife, the woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of making everyone else comfortable. Richard, meanwhile, seemed unusually energetic. He worked the crowd with the confidence of a man who knew he was about to get everything he wanted. I watched him shake hands and accept congratulations, saw the way he kept glancing at his watch, noticed how he positioned himself near the makeshift podium we had set up for toasts. Carla was in her element, holding court near the hors d'oeuvres table, accepting sympathy for her recent widowhood while simultaneously managing to remind everyone how difficult it was to live with someone going through such a hard transition. She was laying the groundwork, preparing the audience for what was coming. But I was laying groundwork too. At 7:30, right after dinner, and just before the toasts were supposed to begin, Richard stood up and tapped his wine glass with a spoon. The familiar sound brought conversations to a halt, and everyone turned toward him with expectant smiles. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The romantic speech from a husband celebrating 30 years of marriage. Thank you all for being here tonight, Richard began, his voice carrying easily across the yard. 30 years is a significant milestone, and it's important to mark these moments with the people who matter most to us. I smiled and nodded, playing my part perfectly. Around me, guests murmured their agreement and raised their glasses in preparation for a toast. But, Richard continued, and something in his tone made the crowd shift uncomfortably. 30 years is also long enough to recognize when something isn't working anymore. The smiles began to fade. Conversations stopped entirely. I felt the attention of 50 people shift from Richard to me, waiting to see how I would react to whatever was coming. I've come to realize that I need something different in my life. Someone younger, someone who understands what I need at this stage of my life. And that means, he paused dramatically, savoring the moment, that Diane needs to move out of this house. Tomorrow. The silence was absolute. I could hear the wind chimes on the back porch, the distant sound of traffic from Lincoln Avenue, the sharp intake of breath from my daughter Rachel. But no one spoke. No one moved. Everyone was frozen in shock. Except Carla, who began a slow, deliberate clap. "It's time," she announced to the stunned crowd, her voice ringing with satisfaction. Richard deserves better than someone who has never understood her place in this family. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, gracefully, with the poise of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents, official looking, impressive in its weight. "You're absolutely right, Carla," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "It is time. Time for everyone here to understand exactly what kind of people you and your son really are." I walked to the podium and gently moved Richard aside. He looked confused, uncertain for the first time all evening. This wasn't part of his script. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, addressing the crowd with the same tone I had used for parent-teacher conferences for 33 years. "I appreciate your patience while my husband and his mother have performed their little drama. But now, it's time for some truth." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. This, I held it up so everyone could see, is the deed to this house. You'll notice that it lists me as the sole owner. That's because this house was a gift from my parents when Richard and I got married. My parents, who wanted to make sure their daughter would always have a home. The crowd stirred. Richard's face went pale. "This house," I continued, "has never belonged to Richard, despite what he and his mother have been telling people. In fact, Richard has been living in my house for 30 years, not the other way around." I pulled out the second document. "This is a record of all the money Richard has been secretly moving from our joint accounts into accounts with only his name on them. Over the past year, he has stolen, and yes, I use that word deliberately, nearly $200,000 from accounts that contained money I earned and saved." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people actually stepped back from Richard as if financial fraud might be contagious. "And this," I pulled out my phone and connected it to the small speaker system we had set up for music, "is a recording of Carla explaining to someone, I believe it was a lawyer, how they planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my house." Carla's voice filled the yard, tinny, but clearly audible. She's getting older, showing signs of confusion. It shouldn't be hard to convince a judge that she's not capable of managing property. Once we have guardianship, we can sell the house, and Richard can buy something more appropriate for our needs. The reaction was immediate and visceral. People turned to stare at Carla with disgust. Someone actually said, "Oh my God," out loud. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was 78 and sharp as a tack, looked at Carla with such contempt that I thought she might spit, but I wasn't finished. "The most interesting thing I discovered," I said, pulling out one final document, "is that Richard has already been living with another woman. Her name is Jennifer Walsh. She's 34 years old, and she's been receiving money from my stolen accounts for the past 8 months." Richard's face went from pale to gray. Someone in the crowd, I think it was his business partner Mike, actually laughed out loud, the kind of shocked, involuntary laugh that comes when something is so outrageous it's almost funny. So you see, I concluded, Richard was right about one thing. 30 years is enough. Enough lies, enough manipulation, enough treating me like I'm the problem instead of recognizing that I'm the solution. But there's one thing he got wrong. I stepped closer to the microphone, making sure every word carried to every corner of the yard. Nobody is moving out of my house except the people who don't belong here. And that would be you, Richard, and you, Carla. You have until tomorrow afternoon to collect your belongings and leave my property. The crowd erupted. Some people applauded. Others whispered furiously among themselves. Rachel pushed through the group of people and wrapped her arms around me, tears streaming down her face. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help you." "You can help me now," I whispered back, "by remembering that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's scary." Richard tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. "You can't just. There are legal procedures." "You're absolutely right," I said. "There are legal procedures, and I've followed all of them. My attorney has been very thorough. You, on the other hand, have committed several felonies, starting with financial fraud and including conspiracy to commit elder abuse." I pulled out one more paper, the document I had been saving for last. "This is a restraining order," I announced. "Effective immediately, you are both prohibited from contacting me, entering my property, or attempting to access any accounts or assets in my name. Violation of this order is a criminal offense." Carla finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. Richard is your husband. You can't just throw us out." "Watch me," I replied. The police officers I had asked Susan to arrange were waiting by the back gate. They stepped forward now, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of people who knew exactly what they were doing. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," the senior officer said, "we're here to ensure that this situation remains peaceful. We understand that you'll be collecting your belongings and leaving the property. We're here to make sure that happens without any problems." Richard looked around desperately, as if someone in the crowd might step forward to defend him. But every face he saw reflected disgust, disappointment, or simple shock. These were people who had known him for years, who had respected him, who had considered him a friend and a good husband. Now they were looking at him like they had never seen him before. And in many ways, they hadn't. The Richard they knew had been a carefully constructed lie, and lies have a way of collapsing once the truth comes to light. Come on, Mother, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Let's go. As they made their way toward the house to collect their things, escorted by the police officers, the crowd remained in my backyard. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of the awkward, shocked silence that had greeted Richard's announcement, there was now a buzz of supportive conversation. People approached me with hugs, with words of encouragement, with offers of help. Mrs. Patterson grabbed my hands and said, Honey, I've been married for 56 years, and I've never seen anyone handle themselves with more grace under pressure. My old principal, Dr. Morrison, shook his head in amazement. Diane, in 30 years of working with you, I always knew you were strong, but I had no idea you were this strong. My book club friends surrounded me, all talking at once about how they had sensed something was wrong, but hadn't known how to help. My neighbors shared stories of their own difficult times, their own moments when they'd had to choose between peace and justice. But the moment that meant the most came when Rachel stood up on a chair and addressed the entire crowd. I want everyone here to know something, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. For the past 2 years, I've watched my grandmother and my father slowly chip away at my mother's confidence, her joy, her sense of herself. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared to speak up because I didn't want to cause family drama. She looked directly at me. Mom, I am so proud of you for showing me what real strength looks like. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed every woman here that it's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, and long. It wasn't the polite applause people give at anniversary parties. It was the kind of applause people give when they've witnessed something truly remarkable. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, each person made a point of saying goodbye to me personally. They offered help with anything I might need, shared their phone numbers, made plans for lunch or coffee in the coming weeks. I realized that by standing up for myself, I had also given them permission to examine their own lives, their own relationships, their own tolerance for being treated poorly. The caterers stayed to clean up, and I sat in my backyard, in my house, on my property, watching the sun set on what had started as the worst day of my life and had become the first day of my new life. Susan Chen called me later that evening. How did it go? She asked. Better than I could have imagined, I replied. Richard and Carla are gone. The police said there were no problems. And I think half the neighborhood is ready to nominate me for mayor. Susan laughed. You know, in 20 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of people in your situation. Most of them spend years in court, fighting for scraps. But you handled this like a chess master. You didn't just win, you won so completely that there's nothing left for them to fight about. She was right. By the end of the weekend, Richard had returned the stolen money to avoid criminal charges. Carla had moved in with her sister in Wisconsin, apparently deciding that Chicago was no longer suitable for her lifestyle. The divorce papers Richard had prepared were worthless since they had been based on false information about asset ownership. I kept the house, of course. I kept my pension, my savings, my dignity, and my self-respect. But more than that, I had reclaimed something I hadn't even realized I had lost. My own voice. 3 months later, I started teaching again. Not full-time, but as a volunteer tutor for adult literacy programs. I discovered that I loved helping people learn to read, to write, to express themselves clearly and confidently. There was something poetic about spending my days helping people find their voices after I had spent so many years learning to use mine. I also started a support group for women going through difficult divorces, particularly older women who felt intimidated by the legal system or ashamed of their circumstances. We met in my living room, in my house, once a week, sharing stories, sharing strategies, and sharing the kind of strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. Rachel visited often, and our relationship became deeper and more honest than it had ever been. She had started standing up for herself at work, setting boundaries with friends who took advantage of her kindness, and generally living with the kind of confidence I wished I had taught her years earlier. You know what the best part of this whole thing was? She asked me one Sunday afternoon as we worked in the garden. What's that? Watching you realize how amazing you are. I always knew it, but I don't think you did. She was right. For 30 years, I had defined myself by how well I could make other people comfortable, how successfully I could avoid conflict, how perfectly I could play the role of the supportive wife and mother. I had made myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared entirely. But that night, at the anniversary party, when I stood up in front of 50 people and told the truth about who I really was, I remembered something important. I had never been small. I had just been playing small, and I was done playing. 6 months after the party, I received a letter from Richard. It was a long, rambling apology that cycled through blame, self pity, genuine remorse, and back to blame again. He asked if we could meet for coffee, if we could work things out like adults, if I might consider giving him another chance. I read the letter once, then put it in my shredder. Some people might say I should have been more forgiving, more open to reconciliation, more willing to rebuild. But forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and healing doesn't require going backward. I had spent 30 years giving Richard chances to treat me with basic respect and kindness. I had given him chance after chance after chance, and he had used every single one to take more from me rather than give more to our relationship. I was done giving chances to people who saw my kindness as weakness, my patience as permission to walk all over me, my love as something they could take for granted. These days, I wake up in my house, make coffee in my kitchen, and sit in my garden, reading books I choose and thinking thoughts that belong entirely to me. I have dinner with friends who value my company. I volunteer for causes I believe in, and I go to bed each night knowing that I am exactly where I belong. I am 58 years old, and I am not done yet, not even close. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're the woman who apologizes for taking up space, who bends over backward to keep the peace, who gives and gives until there's nothing left, please hear me when I say this. Your silence is not keeping the peace. Your silence is just giving cruel people permission to be crueler. For 30 years, I told myself that being quiet, being accommodating, being endlessly patient was the same as being strong. I believed that if I just loved hard enough, sacrificed deep enough, forgave completely enough, I could somehow love Richard and Carla into being better people. But you cannot love someone into respecting you. Respect is not something you earn through perfect behavior or endless patience. Respect is something you demand. something you require, something you refuse to live without. The truth is, people like Richard and Carla count on your kindness. They count on your unwillingness to make a scene, your fear of being seen as difficult, your deep seated belief that good women always put others first. They use your virtues against you, turning your strengths into weaknesses they can exploit. But here's what they don't understand: there is nothing stronger than a woman who has finally decided she's done being taken for granted. When I stood up at that anniversary party and told the truth about who Richard and Carla really were, I wasn't just defending myself. I was declaring that my life had value, that my happiness mattered, that I deserved to be treated with basic human decency. And you know what? So do you. You deserve a home where you feel safe and valued. You deserve relationships where your contributions are acknowledged and appreciated. You deserve to live without walking on eggshells, without constantly second guessing yourself, without apologizing for existing. You deserve better than Richard and Carla. And more importantly, you deserve better than spending one more day accepting less than you deserve. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Setting boundaries isn't mean, it's healthy. Refusing to be treated poorly isn't difficult behavior, it's self respect. I wish I could go back and tell my younger self these things. I wish I could save her 30 years of shrinking herself to fit into other people's comfort zones. But I can't change the past. What I can do is tell you, it's never too late to remember who you are. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to stand up and say, enough. Your story isn't over yet, and neither is mine. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing in your own life? Have you ever been treated like a supporting character in a story where you should have been the star? Have you ever given so much of yourself that you forgot who you were underneath all that giving? If so, then this story is for you. Share the story with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Share it with the friend who apologizes too much, the sister who accepts too little, the mother who has forgotten that her dreams matter too. Share it with the woman in the mirror who deserves so much more than she's been willing to ask for. Because here's what I know now: we teach people how to treat us. And when we accept less than we deserve, we're teaching them that less is all we're worth. But we're worth so much more than that. We're worth honesty, respect, kindness, and love that doesn't come with conditions. We're worth relationships where we can be ourselves without apology, where our voices are heard and valued, where we never have to choose between our happiness and someone else's comfort. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories for more tales of women who found their voices, claimed their power, and remembered that it's never too late to write a better ending. Because every woman deserves a story where she's the hero, not the victim. And your story, your real story, is just beginning.